Hi everyone, I'm Kelsey from Just Sew, and today I am bringing you part 1 of 3 for my patchwork duffel bag tutorial. So this is a very time-intensive project, but all the steps are actually pretty simple. But I know that constructing a bag can be really intimidating, especially to those of you who have not done so before. So I wanted to do a little tutorial series on when I made my patchwork duffel bag. So here is mine. I'm going to split this into 3 parts because, like I said, it is pretty time extensive, and the way that I filmed this tutorial is kind of more like a sew along. So I didn't want to make one and then make a second one on camera. So I filmed myself as I made my first duffel bag, and then I'm going back over all of the clips with instructions and tips that I learned along the way. One other thing that I'll say too about how I filmed this is it did take me a couple of weeks to make my duffel bag. You might see I'm wearing different clothes in almost every clip because it did take me a couple of weeks. I think that if you really buckle down, you could make this bag in a weekend, but it's definitely a multi-day project. So I just wanted to let you guys know, as you're kind of figuring out when you want to make this project, it will probably take you a couple of days. You definitely cannot do this without the physical pattern, so make sure that you own the Patchwork Duffel pattern. This is by Knot and Thread. It's a pretty popular pattern. You'll be able to find it at justsewstudio.com. And it does call for lining fabric, and then your exterior can either be a solid 1 yard cut of fabric, or you can make it patchwork, which is kind of, you know, the vibe we're going for here, but you can make it with just 1 solid piece of fabric if you want. So make sure you have the pattern and all of the materials listed on the back, and let's dive into the first tutorial. So to start off, we're just going to be doing the patchwork and quilting for our exterior, our pockets, and our end panels. In part 2, we will be making our straps, binding, and cutting everything else out. And then in part 3, we'll be doing bag construction. So let's dive into part 1. So the patchwork version of this patchwork duffel calls for 3.5 inch squares. I decided to use a layer cake because I can get all of the squares I need out of these 10-inch squares. That leaves only a few left over. So first things first, I sorted out all the squares I wanted to use and the ones I did not. So I was really drawn to the more floral prints. Some of the geometric ones I didn't like as much, so I left them out. But you can make that call based off if you're using scraps in your stash or if you're using a pre-cut layer cake. The pre-cut layer cake was the perfect size because you can get 4 3.5 inch squares out of 1 layer cake piece, and you only have a couple left over. So I was able to cut these a few at a time to save time, and then I had a lovely stack of finished squares in the end. Next up, you'll want to arrange them in the pattern that you like. So I really like having all of my colors and prints really spread out in a really random pattern. So you'll want to lay out your bag of the body and then also your pockets and end panels. Next, I just gathered them into stacks for each row. So I gathered them up like this and labeled them row 1, row 2, row 3. Also, I really like to take a picture of my layout before I start piling them up, so I remember what it's supposed to look like if my piles get messed up. And then I just pieced them all together 1 row at a time, and then I assembled my rows together, just like a pretty straightforward patchwork quilt. When it comes to ironing, make sure that you kind of have it mapped out in your head what direction you're ironing your seams, so that when you start to assemble your rows like I'm doing here, your seams nest together perfectly, which means that all of your 4 patches will line up without being skewed at all. So the 2 things are make sure you have a perfect 1/4 inch seam and your seams are pressed in such a way that they nest perfectly. Okay, so now you're going to lay your lining of your bag right side down, and you're going to create your quilt sandwich with your soft and stable and your bag body, as well as your end panels and your pockets. The way that you baste this can vary based off of your preferences. So I always have kind of a hard time basting with soft and stable. I love soft and stable, but it is something that's kind of difficult for me to baste with because it's so thick. It doesn't take two pins very nicely. So the two recommendations I have for you are either sewing the basting, like hand sewing your pieces together, or using a spray baste. So those are kind of your three options: pins, hand sewing, or spray basting, like a spray glue. Once I had them all laid out, I cut my pieces apart kind of roughly just so I could baste them together one piece at a time and then start quilting. So I actually did use pins for my smaller ones because they're so small they're pretty easy to handle. You just want to make sure that your lining stays perfectly smooth and you're not going to accidentally quilt any bubbles into the lining. For my quilt pattern, I chose to quilt a 1/4 inch on either side of the seams. So it kind of created like a little box within each patchwork square. You can quilt this however you want. Some people even get their bag long armed during this quilting phase if you want like a design to it, or you can free motion the whole thing. You can do whatever you want, or you can just do really simple straight lines like I am doing here. So a 1/4 inch on each side, and I made sure to check my lining and make sure it's all smooth after each one to make sure I didn't accidentally quilt any pleats or folds into it. My recommendation when quilting the body of the bag is to quilt the two short sides in the middle and then work out from the middle along the long sides. This helps you work out any pleats or folds that might be in the lining. It helps you work it out from the center outward so that those don't get quilted into the lining. Okay, so by the end of this part 1 tutorial, you should have your exterior pieced and quilted, as well as your end panels and your pockets. So next part, we will be talking about your straps and the interior binding and cutting out all of your pieces. And in the final third part, we'll be constructing your whole bag. I'll see you next time.